In this video, I'm going to be talking about something that I've spent the last couple of weeks thinking about, and that's community preference policies and whether they violate the Fair Housing Act. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about a lawsuit in New York City that alleges that a particular policy there is in violation of the Fair Housing Act. Now, it's important to note up front that I am not a legal scholar. I don't understand the details of the Fair Housing Act or how it's been interpreted in other contexts. So what I'm going to be doing is not actually answering the question here, but rather taking a look at the analysis and the evidence presented by the plaintiffs and trying to understand what is it that we are able to conclude or not conclude from this analysis. So let's back up. Let's talk first about these housing lotteries, right? So New York has a variety of programs that incentivize developers to offer a certain number of units in their newly built buildings at below market rates. And all of those designated affordable apartments are listed on a centralized website, New York City Housing Connect. So here's a few of the listings and what they look like. And so that's a central portal where anyone who's interested in housing can go, and then there's a lottery to determine who gets these apartments. Importantly, however, it's not a pure lottery. In particular, there's a community preference policy, which is basically that in each building, half of the units are set aside for people who live in the area, in the neighborhood, or more specifically, in the community district where this building was built. Now, in New York, there are 59 different community districts spread across the 5 boroughs. Here they are. And so this is the lawsuit. The lawsuit is specifically challenging the community preference policy and claiming that basically this has racially discriminatory impacts, right? So the idea is there are existing patterns of segregation in where people live in the city, and that this policy just serves to perpetuate this existing segregation. So the lawsuit was actually filed in 2015. It's had lots of time to get attention, and there are many, many articles written about this. Here's just an example of some of the headlines that you'll see, right, saying that this city policy is perpetuating segregation, has a dark side. And I think it's interesting to try to investigate this. So specifically, the plaintiffs are claiming a disparate impact on the basis of race. And they hired a professor at Queens College, Andrew Beveridge, to make this case. And so part one of, I'm going to do like a 3-part video blog. This is part 1, where I'm going to take a look at the case made by the plaintiffs. In part 2, I'll take a look at the case made by the defendants, namely Bernard Siskin, who was an expert hired by the city. And then in part 3, I'll kind of add some of my own perspectives on this analysis. Okay, so today, part 1. This report is based on data from 168 different lotteries, meaning different buildings, across a 7-year span. And so in aggregate, there were over 10,000 units allocated by these lotteries. And the report that he compiled is 68 pages long. Now, admittedly, 22 of those are his own CV, but that's still a lot of analysis that's being presented in this report, right? And so in this video, my goal is not to be comprehensive. I'm not going to be able to cover every aspect of what's in the report, but to basically simplify the ideas that he's presenting and also give my take on them, right? So I'm going to omit some of the details in the report. For example, in addition to the community preference, there's other preferences. There's set-asides for city employees, for people with disabilities, and so on. And his report does go into some detail on how he handles that complexity, but I'm not going to talk about that in this video. So let's start with the important question of how could we study the disparate impact of this policy on race? And this is a hard question, but at some level, the answer is we have to compare outcomes for different races, both with the policy and compare that to what would have happened without the policy. Now, this is easier said than done because it's not clear what outcomes should we be comparing. And furthermore, we know what happened with the policy, but how should we estimate outcomes without the policy? But actually, I'm not going to talk about these difficult questions in this video because my critique of Beveridge's report is at a much higher level, which is that they don't really attempt to do this, right? So in some of his analyses don't incorporate outcomes. Some of them don't account for the race of the different applicants. And basically, none of what he writes directly tries to address what would happen without the policy. So without doing this comparison, we don't need to dive into the more difficult questions here. So to support this claim, I'm going to take a look at the 8 tables that are presented in Beveridge's analysis and ask for each table, is the data in it based on outcomes? Does the data account for applicant race? And is it clear how the numbers in the table would be different without the community preference policy? Here are the answers, right? So it says table 1 incorporates outcomes, but doesn't talk about applicant race. And it's not clear what it would look like without the community preference policy. And in general, if you go all the way down the list, there's no table that has 3 check marks. So there's basically no table that's presenting data that could be used to argue that there's a disparate impact on race. Okay, the basic idea of the plaintiff's argument is not hard to understand, right? It's that community preference advantages insiders, and by insiders, I mean people who live in the community district where the building is built. So I'm going to use insiders throughout this video. In that way, I'll use outsiders to refer to anyone who lives in another community district. So community preference significantly advantages insiders. Furthermore, insiders in, say, majority white areas are more likely to be white. Insiders in majority black areas are more likely to be black. Putting these 2 facts together, it seems to follow that community preference perpetuates existing patterns of segregation. Right. So if we look in Beveridge's report, tables 1 and 4 sort of purport to provide some evidence for this first point. Several other tables purport to provide evidence for the second point. We'll dive into more details on how they do that. But basically, none of the analysis in his report actually puts all the pieces together to argue that community preference increases segregation. So that's an important missing component. So if you don't have too much time today, or you don't want to dive into the details, you already have enough information to know why I don't think very much of this report, which is basically that none of his analysis compares outcomes by race with and without the policy. And furthermore, he doesn't really provide any evidence that the community preference policy increases segregation. Of course, this argument could still be valid. I just don't really see the evidence for it in this report. For the rest of you who do want to dive a little bit deeper, this video is going to go into more details about what is in his report and what we can take away from it. So let's start by talking about his units of analysis. Right? So he's going to classify applicants into 4 racial groups: white, black, Hispanic, and Asian. These are intended to be mutually exclusive, and they're based on census reporting. In addition, as I mentioned, I'm going to call applicants insiders if they're from the community district, or outsiders if they're not from the community district where the building was built. Now, furthermore, rather than doing analysis for all 59 community districts separately, he's going to group them into 7 what he calls typologies, basically districts that are majority white, black, Hispanic, and Asian, and districts where there is no majority, but there are plurality white, black, or Hispanic. So what this gives you is basically a bunch of tables in his report that are 7 rows by 4 columns, and they'll break down for each of these typologies what is some data analysis result for each of these 4 groups. Okay, so here's one example, table 1. What are we looking at here? Well, this first number is essentially the fraction of outside applicants who end up being housed in that apartment. So this says 0.5% of outside applicants end up housed in majority white community districts. Okay, so that's very low. By contrast, if you're an insider, right, if you live in the district, 15% get housed. So that's still not great odds, but much better than 0.5%. And then he divides those 2 numbers by each other to say, okay, living in the district essentially gave you 30 times the chance of being housed compared to someone who didn't live in the district. So the interpretation of this is that in majority white districts, insiders basically are 30 times as likely to end up housed as outsiders. In majority black districts, insiders still seem to have an advantage, but they're only 12 times as likely to be housed as outsiders. Now, some things to note about this data. First of all, the data doesn't incorporate anything about race, right? So there's nothing about race of applicants presented here directly. And second, it's not clear what would happen without the community preference policy, right? So you might say, oh, without community preference, shouldn't insiders and outsider applicants be equally likely to match? And the answer is no. And that's because community preference is really only one factor that affects who matches, right? So to sketch this out, let's look at the pipeline. We have a set of applicants. We're going to do some sort of lottery and have some preferences, and that's going to determine which applicants we actually consider. Among the considered applicants, only a subset will be eligible. And then among those found eligible, they're going to get an offer, but they have to still be interested and choose to accept the offer. And at that point, they become housed. Okay? And so community preferences affect who we consider, but they don't affect whether someone's eligible or still interested. And so it's entirely plausible that, for example, outside applicants may have applied to the building, but when push comes to shove and they're actually given an offer, they might be much less likely to accept than insiders. And if that's the case, we would still see this pattern in the data that insider applicants are more likely to be housed than outsider applicants. Right? And so an important question is, without the policy, how much higher would these rates be? And the analysis in Beveridge's report doesn't really allow us to assess that. Now, the city and Siskin also rebut this table, and they specifically point out, well, number one, the table's just showing that insiders get an advantage. Duh, that's the whole point of the policy. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it conveys a disparate impact on by race. Second, they make this point that just because more people from inside the neighborhood may get matched, that could just be because they're more likely to actually follow through. And so they do a sort of logistic regression and say, even among applicants who are considered, those with insider status are much more likely to go through with the process and be housed, about 7 times more likely. Now, I'm not going to comment in this video on that analysis because that's really for a future video, but that's their rebuttal. Let's move on to table 2. Right? So what are we looking at in table 2? Well, in table 2, it has a bunch of big, scary looking numbers like this 691%. How is this 691% calculated? What does it mean? Well, it says, let's look at all of the applicants. Let's say among white applicants, what fraction are insiders? Turns out that's 6.8, 6.9% of white applicants to this building were insiders. Okay, among Black applicants, what fraction were insiders? The answer is less than 1% of Black applicants were insiders in these majority white districts. So then he takes a look at the ratio between these two and then subtracts 1. Why he subtracts 1, I guess the idea is then you can say 691% more. I find the subtracting 1 to actually be more confusing than illuminating, but that's sort of aside the point. The point is that this is telling us white applicants are much more likely to be insiders than Black applicants in majority white districts. Similarly, in majority Black districts, Black applicants are about 3 times as likely to be insiders as white applicants are. Okay, what can we note about this table, other than the fact that first, it's a fairly confusing way to present data. Second, these numbers are actually calculated just based on the applicant pools. They have nothing to do with the outcomes, with who actually got housed. And so even if we had no community preference policy, these numbers would actually be exactly the same because they're only describing the racial characteristics of the insider and outsider applicants. They're not describing the consequences of any policy. Okay, table 3 is actually similar to table 2. He calls this a second method of assessing disparate impact. But again, the numbers in this table actually have nothing to do with the impact of a policy. They're just based on applicant pool. Right? So specifically, this number here, this 169%, is based on the following calculations. It says, well, among insiders, 26% are white. Among outsiders, only 10% are white. So let's take a ratio between those two and subtract 1 again, and we get 169%. In other words, in more plain English, in majority white districts, insiders are 2.7 times more likely than outsiders to be white. So again, this is valuable information to know. I think it might be interesting, but it doesn't tell us anything about outcomes and who matches. And as a result, this data actually tells us nothing about the impact of this policy. Okay, so having gone through the first three tables, he then presents three more tables based on apparently eligible applicants. So remember, before I talked about the fact that not all applicants are necessarily eligible. And furthermore, we can't know based on the data that the city collects which applicants are eligible and which aren't. And so the solution that Beveridge proposes is to look at apparently eligible applicants. Now, apparent eligibility is based on their self-reported income and household data. Right? And so he says, okay, some applicants, for example, might list that they have an income that's too high or too low to qualify for the units in this building. And so we can eliminate those applicants and just focus on the ones that seem to be eligible. There are a couple of problems with this. First of all, there are a lot of applicants who may claim their income is one thing, but then it turns out it's different. And as a result, they're not eligible, even though they appear to be. Furthermore, it can actually go in reverse. So some applicants that might appear not to be eligible, in fact, are found to be eligible and housed. And so in the city's rebuttal, it's pointed out that of the 10,000 or so units in this analysis, about 8.5% of them ended up going to applicants that are not apparently eligible. And that's because after screening, those applicants were found, in fact, to be eligible. So I think it's reasonable to look at the apparently eligible applicant pool instead of the total applicant pool, but both are pretty flawed measures. And so he repeats the same analysis he had, this time for apparently eligible applicants, and all of the critiques I offered before apply here just as well, right? So in table 4, there's no analysis of race, and it's not clear kind of how much of the effect that it's pointing out would happen even without the community preference policy, just based on applicant choices. In table 5, it's really describing among apparently eligible applicants, what is the racial makeup of insiders versus outsiders. There's no analysis of outcomes or who matches. And so all the numbers in this table, as well as table 6, would be identical even if there were no community preference policy. Okay, so if we move on to table 7, before we were looking at either applicants or apparently eligible applicants, let's actually narrow it even further. Let's narrow it to the set of applicants who were housed. So by definition, all of these applicants were found to be eligible. And say, among white applicants who were housed in majority white districts, what fraction were insiders? We can ask the same of Black applicants. So among Black applicants who were housed in majority white districts, what fraction were insiders? We divide those two numbers by each other, we subtract 1, we get 178%. So the right way to interpret this, or a simpler way to interpret this, is just in majority white districts, housed white applicants are 2.8 times as likely to be insiders compared to housed Black applicants. So again, this could be an interesting thing to notice, but it's really, really difficult to interpret that number, right? So one plus is that this actually, in contrast to the previous 6 tables, the numbers in this table are both based on who gets matched and account for the race of the applicants. However, it's still really hard to know what would these numbers look like without the community preference policy, right? And that's because of base rates, right? So white applicants are more likely to be insiders in majority white districts. He already showed us that. And that fact alone could account for discrepancies in this number, the fact that the ratio for white and Black applicants would be different. And so it's not clear how much of this number is really based on the community preference policy versus just based on the fact that white applicants are more likely to be insiders in white neighborhoods, Black applicants are more likely to be insiders in Black neighborhoods. And the exact same critique applies to table 8, right? So in table 8, he cuts the data up slightly differently. He asks, of all insiders that got housing, what fraction are white? And of all outsiders who got housing, what fraction are white? And points out that in majority white districts, whites make up a higher percentage of insiders than outsiders who match. Specifically, housed insiders are 1.9 times more likely to be white and 66% less likely to be Black when compared to housed outsiders. So again, this considers outcomes. It does do a breakdown by race, but it's totally unclear what would happen without the policy because of base rates, because of different rates of application of different groups. So to summarize, the plaintiff's argument that's being advanced is that community preference advantages insiders, and insiders are more likely to belong to the majority race of the community district where a building is built, and that combined, these perpetuate existing patterns of segregation. This argument may have merit, but I find very little evidence for it in the report. So even this first point of how much it advantages insiders, I would say the analysis in this paper doesn't really give a good way of estimating that, because it doesn't account for the fact that insider applicants might be more likely to be interested in the first place in actually matching to this building. In terms of the second point, it's true, the data in this paper shows that insiders are more likely to belong to the race that's in a majority in that area, but that's true with or without community preference. So that doesn't really directly help us understand what is the effect of the community preference policy. And so that's what we really want to do, is we want to see an analysis that combines these two facts to tell us what is the effect of this policy. He doesn't provide any such analysis. You could try to take the data presented in this paper and use it to conduct additional analyses, but presumably that's what he was supposed to do in the first place. So that's what I have for you today. In the next video, I'll take a look at the defense offered by the city and the analyses that they present.